All right. Well, I think we'll get started with our webinar. Thank you for joining us today. Our webinar is Offsetting the Good, the Bad, and the Unknown of Natural Compensation. I hope you've taken our polls, and Mario, you can close those now. We're very proud of the ways the Latornell Conservation Symposium has brought us together over the past 26 years, and we're looking forward to reconvening in 2022. But for now, we're satisfied with our webinar series. We want to bring Ontario conservationists together to talk about the big issues and to develop the collaborations that we need in order to find solutions. So if you haven't already, keep in touch with us by signing up for our newsletter at latornell.ca, and thank you for joining us for our Conservation Matters series of webinars. My name is Deborah Martin Downs, and I'm the moderator of today's session, and I'm the soon-to-be retired Chief Administrative Officer of Credit Valley Conservation Authority and a longstanding member of the Latornell Steering Committee. Before we get started with the formal program, I would like to acknowledge that the Credit River watershed is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The Credit River watershed is also part of the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples today. Treaties made with Indigenous peoples are enduring and include responsibilities for both parties. We affirm that this land and our water is our common source of life, and we must all share responsibility for its care and stewardship for now and future generations. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Please take a moment to think about the history of the place that you're joining us today. So our topic today is of great importance to me, and in fact, it was one of the first tasks assigned to me when I joined Toronto Conservation Authority in 2005, and that was to develop a compensation guideline. And clearly, it was not an easy task, for those documents have taken some time to do. And in fact, when I left in 2013, I thought it was finished, and it wasn't quite done yet. With competing land interests and infrastructure needs for growing communities, protection of features in situ without impact were sometimes very difficult to achieve. We're losing natural heritage more than we were gaining, and sometimes that which we were protecting was not functioning as well as pre-development. So was it worth protecting it in the first place? I'm a fish ecologist by training, and we had been doing compensation under the Fisheries Act for about 10 years at that point. In 2005, and I'll say that was with varied success as well. And for most of my career, I've been undertaking various versions of offsetting or compensation, maybe even before it was trendy to call it that. And as ecologist working consulting, which was the first half of my career, and later with a public body upholding policy, we have been balancing natural heritage, losses, and gains for years. And in more recent years, terrestrial and wetland compensation was being done before guidelines, but without consistency or transparency. And I don't want you to take that as it was all cloak and dagger, but because it was not formally set up as part of a system, projects were not necessarily being tracked, and there was no sanctioned rules around how it was undertaken or how we were financing that. Some will use the terms pay to slay for compensation, but you're going to hear today that this is not the intention of compensation, which is also we refer to equally as offsetting. And there are times when it's the right tool in the toolbox. It's not the only tool. And protection, also known as avoid and or mitigate, are the first tools. And our municipalities have been very clear on that they will apply all the rules first and then make decisions about compensations later. So today is about helping you understand the tools and why you may want to use them, along with some of the considerations when you do so. So without further delay, let's get started on the webinar. The format of our webinar is 3 presentations, followed by a discussion of curated and questions from the floor. We also known as the Q&A box, and that are contributed by our participants. So you've seen the housekeeping rules on the slides this morning, but just a reminder that all of you, our attendees, are muted and you'll not be able to speak or come on video. You will find a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And if you'd like to ask any of our panelists a question, please type it in the box and press enter to have it posted. If you want to direct it to a particular panelist, please feel free to tell us that name as well. And you can upvote a question you like by pressing the thumbs up. We will be reviewing the questions and we'll pose as many as we can to our panelists, and feel free to interact with others in the webinar through the chat box. And I see some of you have already been doing that. And to our panelists, a reminder to use your mute button when you're not speaking, and of course to unmute yourself when you are. You think we'd be used to it by now, wouldn't you? This webinar is being recorded so that members or others who are not able to attend will be able to listen at their leisure. We're really pleased with our turnout today. We had 316 register, and so far we've got 192 on the line, and they're still trickling in. So thank you for joining us. And before I introduce our panelists, let's have a look at the results of the poll we just took. So we've got a pretty neck and neck with Southwestern Ontario and the GTA attending, and of course others from other parts of Ontario. 43% of you are conservation authorities, 18% municipalities, and a few non-government organizations, the provincial ministry and federal ministry. So thank you for joining us. A few consultants as well. How familiar are you with natural heritage compensation? So only 25% of you say you're familiar, 60% somewhat familiar, and 15% not very familiar. So we hope you're going to learn something today. What's your opinion of compensation? So 32% think it's a good tool, 47% of you think it should rarely be used, and 21% of you have no opinion. Luckily, no one says it should never be used. So we'll see whether that changes at the end. And do you have guidelines for use, or are you developing them? And only 21% of you say yes, 17% have it in development, but 34% of you don't have any at all. And of course, there's a bunch that's not applicable to. So it gives you a better sense of where we're at today. All right, so let's introduce you to our first panelist. I'm going to introduce you to Noah Gates. He's the Senior Manager, Ecosystem and Climate Science at Toronto Region Conservation Authority. Noah received his bachelor degree from Brock University, majoring in biology and minoring in environmental policy. His early professional career was spent working for 2 rural conservation authorities as a resource technician and environmental planner. He spent the last 20 years with Toronto Region Conservation Authority working to develop and implement natural heritage strategies, urban forest studies, and green infrastructure initiatives. Noah helped lead the development of the TRCA Ecosystem Compensation Guideline. Noah currently manages the Ecosystem and Climate Change team at TRCA, which helps to direct applied research and knowledge sharing in support of the environmental goals of TRCA and its partner municipalities. So Noah, welcome, and over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Deb. Let me know if anyone's having a problem with hearing me or seeing my screen. And yeah, it was Deb that and her leadership that originally put me down this path many years ago, and Deb's absolutely right that it took us quite a long time to kind of get to where we are today. And that's at least in part because it is such a complex and controversial issue. But I'm glad to be here today, and I'm going to walk through just kind of the there we go. Biodiversity Offsetting 101. So talking a little bit about what it means, so defining it, talk a little bit more about why it's an important tool, touch on some of the challenges of biodiversity offsetting, and then go into the principles, and then end on some of the major components of biodiversity offsetting. So hopefully after the 20 minutes or so, we'll all have a pretty good and shared understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about biodiversity offsetting. So first, what is it? Defining it, and there are several definitions. There's a number of biodiversity offsetting programs worldwide. They all have their own definition, but basically they're all saying the same thing, really. I've got 3 definitions outlined here. But really at the core, biodiversity offsetting is a trade-off, which works to try and offset adverse and unavoidable impacts to the natural system through the creation or restoration of new ecosystems and natural heritage features. And I think this will be relatively sort of well known to most people on the call today, but why do we need biodiversity offsetting? And much of Southern Ontario has quite limited natural cover, in many areas, much less than what's required for a healthy and sustainable natural heritage system. Many of us, municipalities, conservation authorities, other land managers are really trying to strive towards improving biodiversity and the overall natural cover that we have. So kind of short story is that we need more natural cover and not less in most parts of Southern Ontario. And we also know that a lot of stress is placed on natural heritage systems as our landscapes develop. And despite very strong protective policy, it's unavoidable that as our landscapes develop and become more urbanized, there are going to be impacts to natural heritage systems and ecosystems. And there's a lot of things that we can do to try and minimize that. We can collectively work towards strengthening the protective policy. We can look to improving the community design that more effectively integrates nature and natural systems with new communities. And we can continue to communicate the importance of natural systems. But regardless of all of that, impacts will continue to occur. And in that context, biodiversity offsetting has been used and can be used as a really effective tool to help minimize those losses, those unavoidable losses. Some of the challenges of biodiversity offsetting, and this is not an exhaustive list, certainly, so I'm sure that others on the call will have their own experiences and their own thoughts about this, but here are some of the ones that came to my mind. Ecosystems are very complex and very difficult to replicate. And when you're taking something that is well established on the landscape and removing it and trying to replace the same level of function and services that it was providing with a newly restored ecosystem, it can be very challenging and if not impossible in some cases. And part of that is because many ecosystems require a long time to mature and reestablish. Forest, for example, can take decades to mature and improve the functions that they provide. As well, newly restored ecosystems can be very susceptible to other stresses such as invasive species and climate change. And so there's a lot of risk there of taking a more established ecosystem and we're trying to replace it with something that's newer and much more susceptible to impacts. There's also very limited space to accommodate required restoration, particularly in urban landscapes. And as you'll hear later in the presentation, one of the real principles is trying to restore lost ecosystems within close proximity to where the impact occurred, and that can be very, very challenging in an urban landscape. There's also, at least in parts of Ontario, a lack of clear policy and direction. This is changing as more municipalities and other land managers are developing guidelines and policy around offsetting, but certainly in the past, and to some extent, this remains an issue, that there is a lack of direction around how to go about biodiversity offsetting. And the last one I'll touch on here is just the land use planning process is a very linear process with decisions that are being made that have repercussions or impacts for decades to come. And it's hard to work within that sort of rigid and linear system with something like biodiversity offsetting that has unexpected outcomes sometimes, or we don't necessarily know how everything is going to work out. And so it can be very difficult to adapt and be flexible within a somewhat rigid planning system. So to try and address, at least in part, some of those challenges, pretty much without fail, every biodiversity offsetting or ecosystem compensation program that I've looked at and then reviewed have a set of principles associated with them to try and guide the process and ensure that it's as effective and efficient as possible. So what I've tried to do today is to put together a list of 10 principles that I brought together from various documents, most of which are outlined on the screen here, and to pull out those elements that seem to be common amongst most offsetting programs. And so I'll go through each of those principles very briefly now. What I'd like to mention before I do that, though, is that for the first 5 principles, I really see those as being broader than just offsetting. Although I've got them worded here to be specific to biodiversity offsetting, really the principle behind them, I would argue, can be applied to the land use planning process as a whole. So the first one is that strong and clear legislation, policy, and direction must be in place to guide offsetting decisions and actions. So things like establishing limits on offsetting, which ecosystems should not be impacted versus which ones could be open to impacts with offsets, outlining the process for how to determine offset requirements, the importance of engaging communities in decision-making, and the need for monitoring and adaptive measures, just as some examples about the need for legislation and policy in terms of guiding the process. The second principle is, again, I think very relevant to the entire land use planning process as a whole, which is that science and traditional knowledge should be used to guide decisions and design and implementation of biodiversity offsets. The third principle is ensuring that the process is equitable and inclusive, and that all parties have an opportunity to participate. The fourth one is offsetting. The process should be transparent with information and decisions being openly communicated. Again, those are both, I think, very relevant to land use planning in general. The fifth principle is about adaptive management, in that an adaptive management approach should be used, including monitoring and tracking and evaluation to help ensure that offsets are achieving the goals that are established, as well as to help to address some of the uncertainty in outcomes. So I think probably most people are quite familiar with the adaptive management approach, but it's an approach that we strive to undertake in a lot of conservation work, and it speaks to planning and then implementing, monitoring, and learning from what you've done in order to then be able to adapt and improve and be flexible so that we can achieve our outcomes. And as I mentioned before, this can be very challenging and a linear planning process, but I think still a very worthy principle to try and implement. And then the next 5 principles are much more specific to biodiversity offsetting, and this next one is universal across really all programs that I've been a part of and that I have reviewed, which is the mitigation hierarchy, or some version of that really needs to be followed when making decisions around offsetting, and that impacts need to be avoided and minimized to the extent that they can before offsetting should be contemplated. I have a definition there that you can read if you'd like. Felt like that one was a relatively clear and simple definition. And then the diagram on the right is a version of one that you'll see out there in a number of different offsetting programs that basically just outlines what I spoke to. So on the top, you've got the potential impact. You can try and reduce that impact through avoidance, further reduce that impact with by minimizing that, and then finally, and sometimes people call it mitigation. In here and in other diagrams, it's called restoring. So once you've done everything you can to avoid and minimize, there are things that you can do to try and restore on the site or after the impact has occurred. And then whatever's left over is that sort of lasting potential impact, which is the impact that needs to be offset. And so you can see the green box at the bottom is where compensation or offsetting would be contemplated. And the fact that that green line goes past that middle dotted line speaks to the fact that in many cases, there is a desire to try and improve biodiversity or achieve a net gain, which speaks to my next principle, which is that offsetting activities should ideally achieve a net gain or at least no net loss. Again, this is also quite universal in all of the programs that I've come in contact with, but this is not straightforward. In many cases, it's not really outlined what the net gain is. So are we talking about a net gain or no net loss of ecosystem function? And if that's the case, that is very, very difficult to complete or achieve, particularly in a reasonable time frame. Is the net gain meant to speak to the overall size of the ecosystem? So that's a little bit easier to address. But there's a lot of ambiguity, I guess, around what it is that many conservation programs are actually trying to achieve when they speak to a net gain or no net loss. I think it's important to define that, and depending on how you define it, it can be quite challenging, if not impossible, to actually achieve that. I think what is potentially even more important than the debate around no net loss or net gain is the idea of additionality. And so here's a definition from the World Bank Group that they included in their biodiversity offsetting guideline or guidebook that they developed a few years ago. And so what is additionality? It really is, for any offset to be real, it must be additional. So in other words, biodiversity offsets must deliver conservation gains beyond those that would be achieved by ongoing or planned activities that are not part of the offset. And so, like I said, I think this point is actually potentially more important than the debate about net gain or no net loss, and that biodiversity offsetting really needs to achieve additionality and not rely on existing programs or planned restoration activities, because those, in theory, would be happening regardless. The next principle speaks to this concept of like for like. So in most instances, offsetting actions should strive to reestablish the same biodiversity values as were lost. So if a forest is being removed or impacted, then a similar forest ought to be replaced elsewhere on the landscape. Lots of things to consider here: size, structure, and location of the ecosystem, the function of the ecosystem, the cultural values that the ecosystem was providing. So, which I think are also very important to be able to try and offset or replicate elsewhere. And then ecosystem services that were important to the communities. All of those things, I think, should be considered when we talk about that concept of like for like. It's not necessarily just the size of the structure or the size of the ecosystem that needs to be replaced, or even the broad structure. There's a whole bunch of other things that I think need to be considered when you're talking about reestablishing what was lost. And in some instances, it might actually be beneficial to not follow this principle of like for like, where maybe you're removing a forest or impacting a forest, but in that particular portion of the watershed or part of the watershed, a wetland may actually be more valuable. This is a little bit of a slippery slope and hard to manage, and that's why I think in most cases that like for like concept or principle should be followed. But if there is watershed planning or other strategic plans that speak to the importance of different types of ecosystems in a particular area, that information can be used to direct ultimately what's reestablished on the landscape. And the last two principles: offsetting actions should be directed to restoring and securing ecosystems in proximity to where the impact occurred. So two things kind of wrapped up in this one principle. One is that offsetting should be focused on restoring and securing ecosystems, not other actions. And the second part of that is that restoration really should be in proximity to where the impact occurred. Very difficult to do in an urban or urbanizing landscape. One of the experience that TRCA is dealing with quite regularly is impacts will occur in the southern parts of our jurisdiction where there's a lot more development. and much less land available for restoration, and the restoration will be pushed further north and further north and further north to where land is more readily available and less expensive. And really what that does over time is it just, it pushes the biodiversity and the natural heritage system functioning further and further away from potentially where it's needed the most, or arguably where it's needed the most. And then principle 10, the last one I have here, is offsetting actions must be completed promptly, potentially even before the impact occurs, and last as long as the impact, typically in perpetuity. So if we're talking about land use planning impacts, really the offsetting actions need to be established and secured in perpetuity. So then shifting gears a little bit, and we've just got about 3 or 4 slides left. Some of the major elements of biodiversity offsetting. So we've gone through the principles now, which guide how it can happen. Some of the major components of most offsetting programs. There are 4 of them that I've got outlined here. So the first one is, how do you determine when offsetting is appropriate? And you absolutely need some guidance on this. In most cases, this is guided by policy at various levels: municipal, provincial, federal. And really it is kind of situated within the land use and infrastructure planning processes. This is not something that is outside of those processes. It's built in and part of that decision-making process. And although this gap is starting to be filled within Ontario, there still, in my mind, continues to be a gap in this type of policy direction. So a number of municipalities are developing or have developed guidelines, or policy that guides when compensation is appropriate or offsetting is appropriate. But there are still, like I said, many areas where that has yet to occur. And I would say continues to be a gap. The second element then, once you've determined whether the offset can occur or whether the impact with appropriate offsets can occur, the second piece then is determining the requirements for offsetting. So how much offsetting or what sort of actions need to be taken in order to offset the impact. And the way I think about this is there are 2 main components to be addressed when establishing a new ecosystem to offset impacts. The first is the structure of the ecosystem, and there's a whole bunch of things to consider there. So the type of structure, whether it's a forest or a wetland, the quality of the ecosystem impacted, the time that is required to reestablish the lost functions. In many cases, this is considered lag time. So for many of you who are a little bit less familiar with offsetting, you may have heard about lag time, and that's really what that means. It's the time required for a new ecosystem to mature and establish to the point where it's providing similar or comparable functions and services to the ecosystem that was lost or impacted. And in many cases, dealing with all of those things, the structure of the ecosystem, the quality, the time it takes to reestablish that. One approach that is used quite heavily, particularly within Ontario, is to establish replacement ratios, where those replacement ratios may go up depending on the type of feature that was removed or the quality of the feature, or again, the time that it would take to reestablish the lost functions. Another mechanism for this is credits through a habitat bank, for example, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And the second component of reestablishing a new ecosystem is then the land base required to support that ecosystem, right? So there's the structure of the ecosystem, but you also need to have the land base in order to be able to reestablish that ecosystem. As I've mentioned a couple of times, that really should be in proximity to where the impact has occurred, and it can be very, very challenging in an urban landscape because there's not a lot of habitat or not a lot of opportunities to reestablish new habitat, and those properties that are available can be very expensive. So land values are, incredibly expensive, making it very difficult to achieve this. And then the third element is is then the implementing of the offsets. So once you've gone through that, yes, this impact can occur with offsets, and you figured out how much offsetting needs to happen, or what those actions are, we then need to execute that or implement that. And there are several ways to be able to do that. There's restoration that can occur on the same site as the loss. And in many cases, this is actually the preferred approach because it eliminates a lot of the complexity of finding a new site for restoration, for example. And it actually allows the restoration to occur very close to where the impact happened. If that's not an opportunity, then there's restoration that happens on a different site. And again, that's where you'll need to then find a new site, et cetera, et cetera. There's also proponent-led implementation. So the proponent whose actions ultimately led to the impact can lead the implementation of the offsetting actions. And then if that's not feasible or desirable, there's also agency-led implementation, where a conservation authority or a municipality or another agency will undertake the offsetting actions on behalf of the proponent. And this leads into the next point, which is one way in which that happens is cash in lieu. And so funds are provided to that agency by the proponent in order to undertake those actions, those offsetting actions. Another mechanism that is in place in many parts of the world is habitat banking. It hasn't really taken off, at least from a terrestrial perspective, in Ontario. I know DFO from an aquatic perspective is starting to move this way. And there are many habitat banks in other parts of the world. But this is really about establishing protected ecosystems for the sole purpose of selling approved credits to proponents requiring offsetting. So an agency or a private entity will secure either existing ecosystems or lands where they then restore ecosystems, and then use that to sell back to proponents who require offsetting because they have their actions have resulted in an impact to an ecosystem elsewhere. Like I said, that really hasn't is not really a mechanism that's used within Ontario from a terrestrial perspective. And there's, I think, probably quite a few reasons why that has occurred, and we can talk about that if there's some questions about that. And then lastly, the last element, the broad element, is just the monitoring and the tracking component. And this is something that is difficult to do, and in many cases is sort of an afterthought. It kind of actually sort of seems like an afterthought on this slide. But it's really important. It's difficult to do, I think, in a meaningful way. But more and more compensation programs are starting to recognize the importance of this and building it into their programming in a meaningful way. So really critical to monitor and track the results and outcomes of biodiversity offsetting for a number of different reasons. One, so that we can actually implement an adaptive management approach and go in there and make changes and improvements if restoration is not happening the way that we thought it would, but also just to learn and to adapt so that future actions and decisions can be more effective. So with that, I will stop. I hope that was clear and provided kind of a good overview of what biodiversity offsetting is, some of the challenges and principles and elements of offsetting. So I appreciate the time, and I will pass it back over to Deb. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Noah. That was terrific. I think that's a great foundation for our participants and the other presentations we're going to hear. And the one big takeaway I have is that this is a thinking person's job. This is not a checklist job, which we tend to sometimes use. So thank you so much for taking the time to prepare that and speaking with us. But there'll be more from Noah, so don't worry. We've got a chance to have him back on for a panel discussion after this. So our next presenters are Melinda Bessey, Director of Planning and Krista Sharp, Manager of Restoration Services, both from Lake Simcoe Conservation Authority. Melinda is a registered professional planner with over 16 years of public and private sector experience in land use planning, both in Canada and overseas. As Director of Planning at Lake Simcoe, Melinda works with a team of planners, hydrogeologists, natural heritage ecologists, and water resource engineers in the review of development applications from a watershed management perspective. In her role, Melinda has been involved in the development and implementation of offsetting policies, which aim to strike the balance between development and the protection of natural resources. Krista has been working in the environmental sector for 16 years as well, in a variety of stewardship and restoration roles. The restoration team provides technical and financial assistance to private landowners, municipalities, and community groups to implement a variety of restoration projects, including agricultural best management practices, natural heritage enhancements, and stormwater retrofits. Krista currently manages the implementation of the cash and lieu portion of the offsetting policies through the completion of wetland and woodland restoration projects. They are going to be speaking about the experiences and challenges of implementing ecological offsetting. So welcome, Melinda and Krista, and over to you. Please turn on your videos and unmute.
All right, thanks, Deb. Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to be here to chat with you all today. And I guess let's get started. As Deb mentioned, we are going to be speaking to you about ecological offsetting and restoration within our watershed in Lake Simcoe, and our experiences and challenges that we've found along the way. We're going to be presenting on how ecological offsetting has been applied in the watershed, and it's important to recognize that every conservation authority is different, and we all work in different jurisdictions, each with our own unique challenges. First, I'll share some background information on how our ecological offsetting policy came to be, including the important work that was completed to inform the EOP. Next, we'll provide an example of a developer-led offsetting project that we're working on. And then to conclude, Krista will provide examples of projects that we've been undertaking using our offsetting funds. Finally, we'll share a few lessons that we've learned. In 2018, LSRCA finalized a natural heritage system and restoration strategy. A big component of this project was mapping all of the natural areas and identifying a connected system. The green area on the map represents the natural heritage system, so the core features it's composed of. These core features include the natural areas like woodlands, wetlands, valley lands, watercourses, and our shoreline areas. The orange areas, which are a little bit more difficult to see on this slide, represent the opportunities or locations to target for enhancing and expanding the natural heritage system. The strategy set two main targets. The first, no net loss of features, and the second, to pursue a net gain of these features. In addition to the natural heritage system restoration strategy, in late 2017, we also completed a report on valuing capital in the Lake Simcoe watershed. The natural capital and ecosystem service values are measured by placing an economic value or dollar value on the services provided to humans by nature. The features themselves, like woodlands and wetlands, are the natural capital. The ecosystem service values are determined based on the benefits or services that these features provide for people. Determining ecosystem service values is tied closely to where people are located. For example, wetlands that provide flood storage benefit people through avoided flood damage. The chart here is a list of various ecosystem services that were examined through the study and the measurable benefits they provide to people. Overall, natural features in the Lake Simcoe watershed provide residents with just over $922 million in ecosystem service value each year. Next, we wanted to know specifically what the ecosystem service value provided by a woodland or a wetland might be. So ecosystem service values were determined for each ecological land classification community that exists in the watershed. We even included agricultural areas in this. We found that values really ranged depending on the feature, so from as low as $440 per hectare per year for the intensive active agricultural areas to as high as just over $9,000 per hectare per year for the marsh wetland ecosystems. This ecosystem service value stuff is really important, and we're going to loop back to that in a little bit when we talk about how we do our costing for compensation amounts. It's all part of recognizing the economic value of feature in the watershed, and when it comes to ecological offsetting, the part that plays. So that brings us to this. In 2017, we formalized our ecological offsetting policy that applies to all lands within our watershed. This policy has been endorsed by both BUILD and the consulting community. It was also approved by our board of directors. In this policy, we emphasize the importance of using ecological offsetting to balance conservation and economic growth by facilitating development on strategically important land. It also recognizes that not all natural heritage features can be easily replaced. Ecological offsetting is only something considered when there is no other option. In addition, until recently, we were only applying the policy to development that required approval under the Planning Act or the Environmental Assessment Act. However, with the changes to the Conservation Authorities Act, the requirement to issue permits where there is an MZO in place, we've used this policy to inform compensation agreements and accordingly have revised our policy to formalize this approach. So how does it work? Noah spoke to this in his presentation as well. So there's a mitigation hierarchy that must be followed for any development that proposes to remove a feature or part of a feature. Developers must first demonstrate that they have done their best to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts before compensation or offsetting can be considered. They must also demonstrate that their proposed development satisfies all applicable planning policies. Only once a development proposal has received approval and we know that it will result in an approved loss of the natural heritage feature, only then does ecological offsetting policy come into play. And of course, as we just mentioned, with MZOs, we no longer have the benefit of the mitigation hierarchy, and instead we jump right to compensation for those cases. Oops, sorry. LSRCA's ecological offsetting policy focuses on two main feature types, woodlands and wetlands. There are two options to meet the requirements of the policy. Developers can replace the features themselves, or they can make a cash in lieu payment to the LSRCA, and we will complete this work on their behalf. Recognizing that an established woodland and wetland cannot be replaced or on the landscape overnight, it takes years for a man-made feature to get back to something similar to what nature creates on its own. We require the woodland is replaced at an aerial ratio of 2:1 and wetland at a ratio of 3:1. So if 1 hectare of woodland is to be removed, then 2 hectares is to be replaced. In addition, we also require that any buffer or vegetation protection zone that would have been applied to a feature on the landscape is also accounted for, and it is required to be replaced at a ratio of 1:1. If a developer is able to replace the feature themselves, they need to follow these ratio requirements or demonstrate that what they are proposing will result in an equivalent net ecological gain. In addition to physically replacing these features, we also require that the developer pay an amount equal to 1 year worth of ecosystem service value for the features being removed. It is always preferred that the developer is be responsible for replacing the features themselves, but it's not always possible. This is why we offer the cash in lieu option. The cash in lieu amount is determined based on the cost of replacement of those features. The cost under our current policy for woodland is $48,500 per hectare, and wetland is $92,500 per hectare. These values include the cost of planning and design, site preparation, and construction of plant material. It also requires an additional 15% to support land acquisition and 15% to cover administration costs. This is an example of a project that we are currently working on with a developer in our watershed. It is for a commercial development that will require the removal of 0.06 hectares of wetland and 3.10 hectares of woodland, plus an area of 0.3 hectares that would have been a buffer to the wetland feature, or the woodland feature rather. For this proposal, the developer followed the mitigation hierarchy of first avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating as best as possible. They've also proposed a development that satisfies applicable policy for this area. The loss of the woodland and the wetland has been approved, so they need to now compensate for those losses. Fortunately, this developer has the land base and opportunity to replace the feature back on the landscape and nearby, right next door. Based on the ecological offsetting policy, they must replace the wetland at a ratio of 3:1 and the woodland at 2:1 and the buffer at 1:1. This means they're responsible for replacing 0.18 hectares of wetland, 6.50 hectares of woodland, or something that would provide an equivalent net ecological gain. So for this property, the developer is going to recreate 0.6 hectares of wetland represented by the blue areas and 3.5 hectares of woodland represented by the green areas. You're probably thinking that the math doesn't add up, and you're right, it doesn't. The requirement of 0.18 hectares wetland and 6.5 hectares of woodland, or that's what it was, so they're providing 3 times the wetland that was required and a little more than half of the woodland required. This is because with this site, they're working with the landscape available, and it's important to recreate the types of features that make sense. The land needs to be able to support whatever's being created. For this site, they're able to replace more wetlands than required because the conditions are right. And while they're not able to replace as much woodland as required, they're proposing an enhanced woodland that goes above the typical requirements. Their design includes a number of enhancements from habitat features like the ones listed on the slide to larger stock plant material and overseeding with native species. And while this proposal might not fit the offsetting calculation and ratio replacement perfectly, the developer and their consultants have demonstrated that this proposal will provide a net ecological gain to the natural heritage system in this area. In situations where the proponent is not able to carry out the offsetting requirement themselves, they would choose the cash in lieu option. Krista is now going to outline what we do with the funds received through ecological offsetting.
Thanks, Melinda. Next slide, please. So now I'll get into the cash in lieu implementation and review some of our main challenges in restoration. So one of the first things that I want to highlight today is that we're generally finding that there's not enough funds being obtained through what Melinda and her team does to retrieve some of the ratios required to implement wetlands or acquire the lands. And then the second thing is finding the land to actually do the work. And then of course, some of the general construction, because a lot of these are construction projects and the challenges that everyone will have regardless of how this is funded. So some of the details on the cash in lieu piece is that 15% is taken in for admin, 5% is used for our finance department for corporate overhead, 10% is used for restoration services overhead to essentially find and develop project. And then the 85% is used for implementation, which includes everything like design, construction, permits, monitoring of these projects, and the staff for project construction management. So we always just strive to achieve the replacement value of the woodland and wetland loss, but sometimes this is not achievable. So we're finding that instead of sometimes of the 3-to-1 exactly for like say wetland, we add other co-benefits and other natural heritage features in there, or we add other funding mechanisms to the project. So funds are also to be spent in the sub-watershed, in which to date, this has not been a problem to find a project within the same sub-watershed to do the implementation of where the money came in. Additionally, the fund should be spent on public lands instead of private land. This is to ensure that the restoration activities are kept in perpetuity. But this is also becoming a challenge as we are quickly running out of conservation authority land to do this work, as well as finding available public property to do the work. It's really hard to come by. So each project is reviewed by an internal review committee. And then the last piece of our cash in lieu program is either LSRCA leads the design and construction implementation, or we can also provide funding to another project partner to implement the project with the conservation observing the process, and those agreements put in place in these types of scenarios. Next slide, please. So here are some of the overall results of the program from the start in 2017 until December 31st, 2021. So this is 2020, sorry, this is not including 2021 at this point. So in the time across our watershed, LSRCA has collected over $3.7 million, which is an approximate loss of 40 hectares of wetland and 90 hectares of woodland. And we have spent approximately $780,000 on restoration and acquisition projects. And I'm going to review some of these outputs in the next slide because this obviously this is a bit hard to read. Next slide, please. So the total area restored between 2017 and 2020 is over 10 hectares and includes all habitat types and features. So this is including some of our wetland projects, our woodland projects, some grassland areas, and other habitat features like adding mammal mounds, turtle habitat nesting, as well as the piece of acquired land that we were able to do. So our wetland projects have included 3, which occurred all on Lake Simcoe owned land. And then there were 3 woodland projects on Conservation Authority land, and there's 1 that we did that was owned by a municipality. And then the acquisition was a small acquisition, which will protect a significant wetland in the town of Innisfil. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go into detail about a couple of projects that we have completed. So we continue to focus our efforts on introducing new or expanding on existing wetland features within our watershed. So this wetland project was completed in the fall or winter of 2019 and 2020. It's located on the Luck property, which is in the town of Innisfil, and is owned by the Conservation Authority. So as you can see here, it's a bit of a fallow field. It was a bit of a blank slate for us to improve on the natural heritage system and expand on the adjacent wetland, which was to the east of this property. So if you can imagine that drawing, and it's just, dropped right onto the photo there, you can see that there was 3 wetland features that you see in the green, and then a meadow that's in the yellow, as well as there was a variety of features that were added to improve on the full total biodiversity on the site. Next slide, please. So this is just a picture of the construction as it's wrapping up. The 3 wetland pockets totaled 0.5 hectares, which will provide filtration and overland flow on this site, as well as critical habitat for herpetofauna. So we always try for a cut-fill balance so that we don't have to take fill off-site, which obviously increases the cost of construction. So all of the fill on the site was used in other habitat features to enhance other things on the property, which reduces our costs and makes it easier to create these features. Next slide, please. So the last 1.5 hectares of natural heritage on this property was the grassland area. There's lots of tree and shrub plantings that occurred. We had a lot of invasive species control and removals on site, as well as these mounds. They're a little bit hard to see in the picture, but we installed some mammal mounds, which could be used for bank swallows or insects or mammals. So we'll be monitoring these over time. And this is where the majority of the fill went from the property to create these features. And next slide, please. So this is the site in early spring 2021, showing the cattails emerging. Overall, the site is doing really, really well. We are struggling with 1 of the 3 wetlands that are drying up a little bit too early in the season. So we're going to continue to monitor this one closely to see if there's any enhancements or any things we can do to get it functioning as we were hoping it would be functioning. The total cost of this project was approximately $80,000, which, as I alluded to earlier, was a 0.5 hectares of wetland and 1.5 hectares of other natural heritage features. Okay, next slide, please. So we've also approved funding for 4 projects, which were completed in 2021 and 2022. So 2 are now completed or in progress, and the other 2 will be started in 2022. So 3 of these are actually on municipal land, and we actually have our first project that has been approved to be implemented on private property. So the first few years of implementation was primarily on Conservation Authority land, and we're slowly now getting other partners, municipalities and other groups to work with us. And then on the private property side, we're thinking this is the route that we're going to need to go down, because we really are truly struggling to get public property to do the implementation, but there's a lot to sort out with the private property. For example, with this particular one, it is a very expensive project, which means the landowner is going to have to put some of the remaining funds to it, as well as we have to prepare an agreement, like a grant contract or a memorandum of understanding, to ensure that the landowner protects this project to the best of their ability for the future. I'm going to go provide an example of something that we did this year during COVID. So it adds a little bit of extra challenges to what we're doing. So this is a 2.1 hectare site, which is located in Guildford in the town of Innisfil. So this contained an open green space that was supposed to be used for the general public and some of the landowners around there, but it was seasonally wet. So it means that it was not very useful to them as a property. So the main purpose of this project was to install new wetland features for a total of 0.5 hectares, and then another 1.4 hectares of other natural features, which is to create a more usable space for the local residents. The design on the right, you can see the two wetland features. There's some grassland area as well as native trees and shrubs, and then some other structures to improve biodiversity, pollinator habitat, and then primarily to address the local drainage that was that they're having issues there. Next slide, please. So you see in the picture, we did install a turtle nesting site and osprey nest, and then you can see that they're planting aquatic species in the wetlands. So we originally didn't do a ton of plantings on site because we decided to pull a lot of them from the original plan to engage the community in community planting events. So we've had first probably 2 or 3 events that we're going to try to get the community out to take ownership of their backyard. Because with a lot of these types of projects, we have these challenges where the public generally doesn't like wetlands or the messy look of what natural areas look like. So we're hoping by engaging the community, it'll alleviate some of these concerns that they have, and they kind of will take ownership of what's in their backyard. So as well as with this project, one of the challenges we had was that construction was during the winter, but the site got way too wet and we had to shut it down. And then we started back up in June of this year, which delayed our project a bit, as well as added some additional costs due to construction happening at different times of the year. And then COVID also increased our prices because everything is just more expensive right now. So it increased this one as well. Next slide, please. So the Circle Park project cost approximately $115,000, which, as I said, resulted in 0.5 hectares of wetland and 1.4 hectares of other natural features. So as you can see with the 2 examples of Loch and Circle Park, we didn't fully achieve the 1.3 ratio, but it's a little bit more of a concern with Circle Park, as we said, the price increase quite a lot for a very similar project. But during COVID, everything was just costing a lot more. So what we'll continue to do with this program is we're going to continue monitoring and suggest changes to the offsetting program as we implement these more projects, so we can try to alleviate some of these concerns and some of the issues that we're having on the implementation side. So I think it's back to you, Melinda, sorry.
Great, thanks, Krista. So just a few lessons that we've learned along the way. 1, engage in discussions about offsetting very early. So for those of you who've joined this webinar who are working on the planning approval side, talk about this in pre-consultation, talk about this loudly in pre-consultation, and make sure that the proponents clearly understand your offsetting policies and that they can't come in with a submission that does not include any policy justification for removal of a feature, because their justification is, oh, we're going to apply offsetting, because that's not how it works. The second, work with your landscape, not against it. The third would be identify the natural heritage goals and objectives, consider how they might work with or conflict with the proposal. Get everyone on the same page. Again, back to that pre-consultation and early discussions, make sure all the players in the game have a very clear understanding of how offsetting works. Keep an open mind, be flexible. Embed the offsetting policies in your local municipal official plans. That really helps. Be a matchmaker. For those of us on the planning side, again, sometimes we see, the project we're dealing with where there's a request to apply offsetting or compensation, and yet we see another project where perhaps rather than a cash in lieu situation, they can maybe partner up with another landowner and the offsetting can occur on lands nearby. And finally, remember that you're doing great work. I know sometimes it can be a bit disheartening to see all these proposals for removing features from the landscape, but remember, without offsetting policies, sometimes, before them, features are being removed and there's no replacement. And so we are doing great work and we are getting features back on the landscape. And thank you for your time, everyone.
Thank you, Melinda and Krista. That was great. It gave us a lot of thought process to get the wheels turning on the challenges of undertaking compensation and some of the realities. So just a reminder to the participants, put your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. you'll see the Q&A box. There's some great questions there already, so please feel free to vote them up. Someone else's question, you press the thumbs up button, and that will give us a little more importance to a particular question to ask first. So our last presenter, last but not least, is Laura Hockley. She's the environmental analyst of Natural Resource Solutions, Inc. Laura has a degree in geography and diploma in ecological restoration from the University of Waterloo. She started her career at NRSI as a GIS specialist and is now more heavily involved in EIS and restoration work. Laura will be taking us through a couple of case studies to provide the consulting experience in applying offsetting. So Laura, please turn on your video and unmute and take it away.
Thanks, Deb. So I'm going to be giving the consultant's experience, as she mentioned, and I'll provide some case studies and, sorry, I'm not able to go next there. Provide some case studies on ecological offsetting, one in Peel region using CVC's guidelines, then the second involving woodland compensation at Sydenham River Nature Reserve, and then finally I'll provide some overall thoughts on offsetting and our experiences. So the first case I'm going to talk about is a site in Caledon, north of Brampton. A single detached dwelling is proposed on the property, and NRSI completed an environmental impact study in 2019. This property contains many sensitive natural features, including an area of natural and scientific interest, significant woodland, provincially significant wetlands, significant wildlife habitat, species at risk habitat for butternut and Jefferson salamander, and core greenlands as designated by the town of Caledon and region of Peel official plans. So the picture on the right there shows the current driveway entrance to the site with significant woodlands on either side. And the restoration plan that I'm going to speak about was only recently approved by CBC, so we are still working with the landowner in coordinating other aspects of the project, so the plan has not yet been implemented. This map shows the proposed development area in red, which is within the significant woodlands, as shown by the drip line in this green dashed line. Although the development area is mostly within an opening, it is still considered significant woodland due to its small size. There was a debate about where to place the house, and the Conservation Authority wanted the house as close as possible to the road. So we had to balance the wishes of the landowner versus the Conservation Authority and came up with this location, which maximizes the location within the existing open meadow area, but infringes into the cultural savanna, which is mostly comprised of non-native species. So this green shading is also the provincially significant wetland. And as you can see, it's pretty far removed from the development. And we also found butternuts on the site, also far away from the development envelope. Jefferson salamander was also found near the wetlands, and MECP has mapped the property as a movement corridor for the species. These pictures show the open meadow community where the development envelope is, and it has been heavily influenced and was likely previously forested. There are deer stands and an old camper trailer, all along with various junk and garbage scattered throughout this opening. So CVC's offsetting guidelines were used to determine habitat compensation for the development within the significant woodland. Offsetting activities should target an overall net gain with a no net loss at a minimum to replace ecosystem structure and functions. And that includes considerations for trees, understory and ground cover vegetation, as well as invasive species that are present or proposed to be removed. Wildlife habitat must also be considered in terms of replacing function. Our first step was to determine how much area needed to be replaced, and the limit of development within this property equals 0.23 hectares, as shown by this red dashed line. We are proposing to restore 0.32 hectares, which is a 39% increase in land base, shown in pink. It also includes the existing laneway because the driveway entrance had to be relocated due to regional requirements for a sightline. We also had to determine how many trees need to be replaced. So we conducted a tree inventory shown in this image here for trees at least 5 centimeters diameter at breast height and came up with a tree planting requirement of 427 trees. The limit of development is shown in this black line, and the solid gray trees are to be retained while the hollow trees are to be removed. Some trees outside of the development area are also proposed to be removed because they are dead and could pose a potential hazard to the development. Next, we determined how many shrubs and how much seed mix would be required using calculations provided in the CBC guidelines, which amounted to 253 shrubs and 4.6 kilograms of seed mix. The guidelines also allow for discounts when removing invasive species from the development envelope. We inventoried a number of invasive species from this area and calculated the offset discount for each layer. The final two columns of this table show the initial requirements and the final requirements based off of these discounts of invasive species removed. So our overall restoration goals for this site are to achieve no net loss of natural features, create woodland feature and function within this open area, and remove and control invasive species within the restoration area, create wildlife habitat, and improve the natural cover and connectivity between the natural features. The low quality habitat within this woodland opening is to be replaced with higher quality habitat and more diverse habitat. This will create a natural buffer between the dwelling and the woodland. Low growing vegetation, including shrubs and herbaceous species, will provide cover and limit the potential predation of Jefferson salamander that may be using these habitats. The restoration prescription for the site includes initial site preparation, including topsoil amendments in the area of soil compaction, and the application of a nurse crop to stabilize the soils. The current driveway entrance near the road has compacted soils and will be restored. We will create wildlife habitat by having select large trees that are removed at the time of construction within the development envelope, delimbed and left in suitable locations as downwoody debris. And these are shown as logs within our restoration plan. Potted trees and shrubs are to be installed with liquid browse deterrent applied. CBC guidelines require that trees are at least 150 centimeters tall. We propose species such as sugar maple, ironwood, white pine, trembling aspen, black cherry, bur oak, red oak, and American basswood based off the surrounding conditions, along with a number of other shrub species. A native seed mix will be applied to the entire restoration area. A meadow seed mix is proposed to provide a transition habitat and better pollinator species as this area transitions to a woodland feature. A 5-year monitoring period is proposed where there will be inspections at the 1, 3, and 5-year mark to assess performance measures. Buckthorn will also be managed within the restoration area within those 5 years. So in order to determine if the restoration is going according to plan and to determine if it is actually a success at the end of the 5-year mark, the objectives will be measured. This is an adaptive management approach that lets you assess at multiple times throughout the 5 years. The longer monitoring time also allows for natural succession to occur within that time frame. Trees and shrubs will be counted with 50-meter square forestry circular plots to see if the target density of 1,000 stems per hectare, consistent with the Forestry Act definition of a woodland, is achieved. Trees and shrubs that grow through natural succession will also be counted in this target. The seed mix will also be monitored to determine if a majority of the species are present. There is already existing vegetation within the restoration area, so it is expected that these species will comprise at least 10% of the ground cover relative to existing vegetation. Seed presentation may not be evident until the end of the 2nd year. So as I mentioned, that site hasn't been implemented yet, but this study was done years ago, and we have actually started planting and implementing many of the restoration measures. And this involves restoration at Sydenham River Nature Reserve. This project relates to a proposed residential subdivision in the town of Plimpton, Wyoming, along Lake Huron in Lambton County. NRSI completed an environmental impact study between 2016 and 2018. Much of the property is designated as significant woodlands by the township and county. However, it is mostly second growth cultural woodland and shrub thicket as a result of previous land use as a children's camp, which stopped about 50 years ago. There are also some smaller pockets of green ash lowland deciduous forests, which have been impacted heavily by emerald ash borer. There are some localized deciduous swamps which may also have been created from prior human land use, such as ATVing. The property is regulated by St. Clair Region Conservation Authority due to the dynamic shoreline, steep slopes, and wetlands. Through the EIS, we found habitat for wood thrush, terrestrial crayfish, and special concern plant species. So these are a few photos of the site showing some of the ATV trails, some of the open areas that were cleared through the children's camp, and the green ash woodlands. So we worked with the developer to minimize the development footprint and maximize the retention of existing natural features. The proposed development is to include lots, a new road, servicing, and a stormwater detention basin. Through the detailed design, we are also determining individual tree retention within the lots. Overall, 4.08 hectares of woodland removal is proposed, which equates to 30% of the woodland within the property. Much of the woodland to be removed contains standing dead and declining green ash that have been affected by emerald ash borer. It is expected that the canopy coverage and tree density would continue to decline as ash trees die off, which would increase the dominance of shrub thicket species, including invasive species. This map shows the proposed development plans overlaid onto the vegetation communities, and the stormwater detention basin is proposed within this swamp community. It was determined that ecological offsetting would be required to compensate for the woodland and wetland removals. A 2-to-1 woodland replacement of land area is required by the township. However, they only required the area of woodland as defined by the county to be counted in that. So this resulted in only 2.41 hectares required to be compensated for. Therefore, 4.82 hectares of woodland was required to be recreated either on-site or off-site. Within the property, the plantings are to contribute to the natural heritage system of Lambton County. Plantings have already been installed within the stormwater detention basin, which is to compensate for loss of wetlands and replicate wetland function. Trees, shrubs, and wetland cements were installed. Pit and mound treatment was also used to create habitat for terrestrial crayfish. Exposed clay soils adjacent to standing water areas were created to mimic the natural moist wetland fringe conditions favored by the species. So there wasn't much room to plant on the site. So we made a deal with Sydenham River Nature Reserve to restore off property. They have a property of 77 hectares in total. So we were going to restore a 6-hectare field within that property. And we are to restore a woodland, which is 1,000 trees per hectare. We're going above the requirements of the development conditions as part of a broader restoration and management plan for the entire property and to ensure that the full potential is realized. This is the first offsetting agreement Ontario Nature has undertaken, so there's high precedent to implement effective strategies. So this is the field in question where we are currently restoring. This pink area shows the 6-hectare restoration site where we will be restoring woodland. Pit and mound treatment was done in the orange hatched areas outside of the regulation limit shown in blue. The restoration is a joint effort between Ontario Nature and NRSI and the developer. All introduced plant material is to be from seed zone 37 or 38, and on-site seed collection occurred in 2019. Ontario Nature completed the seed mix application and pit and mound treatment, which is used to create microhabitats and promote groundwater recharge. Both Ontario Nature and the development company and NRSI are responsible for tree planting on the site, which is to occur over numerous phases. Tree planting stock is being used to combat herbivory by having trees 2 meters or taller, since Ontario Nature does not allow for herbicides or pesticides. A 5-year monitoring plan similar to the first case study I mentioned is being used. So we have found native succession already occurring from nearby sycamore, eastern cottonwood, and other tree species within the restoration area. There were some delays in the early rounds of tree planting because of COVID. At the time of planting in spring 2021, the pits were full of water and tadpoles were within them. Spotted salamanders were also found under cover objects that Ontario Nature had placed throughout the site after agricultural activities ceased. We still have some more planting and monitoring to do, but this photo here shows us planting in the last spring where we were planting some fairly large tree whips, hoping that the deer would not destroy them. So based on our experiences with implementing restoration and using offsetting guidelines, I polled some of my coworkers and we came up with some thoughts on offsetting. So we have not often encountered a specific protocol or guideline when having to implement ecological offsetting. It's not as common. So the guidelines can create a transparent process and landowners will know that other landowners will be treated the same way. The guidelines can be good because they provide clear direction, but should allow for flexibility, such as changing and planting stock or other issues that may come about on site-specific situations. Where guidelines are lacking, it leads to a delay in approvals because there is a lot more back and forth, and some advisory committees can be unrealistic in their expectations. Feature or habitat removal can be an efficient use of the land. For example, rather than reconfiguring site designs around a small wetland or woodland, it can be more efficient to remove and compensate. But in these cases, compensation guidelines are very important. Without compensation requirements, small and isolated wetland removals will continue with unintended cumulative impacts to the natural heritage system. There is evidence that suggests that in urbanized areas, it's the small units that provide the highest function per unit area. Overall, a restoration goal for a feature or habitat creation should be considered rather than just a count of tree or shrubs that need to achieve survival. And that is all I have today. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, Laura. That was great. And I'm glad you mentioned about invasive species and the credit and the management of that, the recognition of the change over time, and including managing those invasive species from coming in and taking over, because I know that's been one of our huge issues. So at this time, we're going to start with getting our speakers back on screen. And we're going to ask you to turn your cameras on, and we're going to have a bit of discussion, give our audience a chance to have some of their questions answered. And as a reminder, if you want to ask a question, please enter it in the Q&A box at the bottom panel bar. And if you want to vote up a question someone's already asked, please just put your thumbs up there, and it will help to rank it up, put it up the rank a little bit more. So. Okay, so I'm just going to change my view so I can see everybody. There we go. So I'm going to start us off with a panel question, and then we'll get into the Q&As from the chat box, or from the Q&A box rather, questions from the Q&A box. But so I'm going to direct this to all of you, and I'd like anyone who wants to provide an answer in is that. You've had a chance to implement guidelines. You're obviously created them. You're implementing them, but all of you have had some experience in that. Are there any additional tools that are needed to make it successful? And if so, what might those be? So I don't know, Noah, you want to start us off with that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that there are some additional tools for sure that can really help with the success. And then this is brought up generally in a couple of the presentations, but understanding the landscape in which you are working within is very important. To be able to help direct, well, not only to be able to determine whether the proposed impacts are acceptable or not, but also when that decision has been made, to be able to identify where effective restoration could occur. And so with TRCA, we have developed what we call our integrated restoration prioritization tool, which has looked at our landscape and identified potential restoration opportunities throughout the landscape, taking into a whole bunch of different data layers and considerations from important connectivity areas to areas that are adjacent to other natural features that would build up those areas and to create some more interior habitat, to important areas from a water management perspective. So the whole bunch of different things, and we so now have a catalog of potential restoration areas that we can then go to and use as a way of identifying the most effective or highest priority areas for restoration when we are faced with needing to offset an impact. So I think that's one that comes to mind for sure. That's really useful, is being able to strategically understand where the highest priority is for restoration and land securement. Maybe I'll leave it there and let others jump in.
Anybody else want to provide some insight on that?
I'll provide a really quick and easy one.
Yeah.
Something we're working on, just like an online calculator tool, because we get a lot of the calls of, well, how much will the offsetting be? And what is the amount we'd have to replace? And even though it's outlined in the policy, might be easier if there's just a one-stop shop on our website to click and just have, we have a Excel spreadsheet, so something like that, which I think would be helpful to those having to apply the policies. So we're working on that.
Well, that'd be cool, actually. And I think some people assume that it'll just be a cheaper alternative to their proposals, and that's not always the case anymore, is it? So anybody else want to provide any thoughts on that? No, I'm not seeing. Give me a little thumbs up or a thumbs down or something. Yeah, we're good. Okay. All right. Thank you for that. All right. Perhaps one of the questions that seems to be coming up a little bit is the difference between offsetting and habitat banking, and how do we see them as a different tool in the toolbox? And so, can anybody just expand on that a little bit more?
I guess I can jump in on there. So the difference between offsetting and habitat banking, I think habitat banking is an approach to offsetting. It's a mechanism that's used in a number of different areas, really throughout the world, that allows for areas to be secured and restored as a bank for future impacts. So it's less about a kind of comparison between biodiversity offsetting and habitat banking, because I think habitat banking is kind of a mechanism or a tool or a framework that can be used to help operationalize offsets. I don't know if that gets to the answer or not, or to the ultimate question, but yeah, that's kind of my first kick at it, I guess. It's like I said in my presentation, it's not something that's really been used from a terrestrial perspective in Southern Ontario, but it is widely used, worldwide. The most famous examples are is in Florida, but it's kind of used across the U.S. these days, particularly around addressing impacts to endangered species. And again, very quickly, the way it works is that, and in many cases, it's a privately owned entity that that secures the bank of habitat, and then they sell credits to the proponent who is proposing impacts to endangered species or their habitat of endangered species. And I think it's worked very well in some areas. There's been a whole bunch of studies that if people are interested, we could try and find some links to those, but that kind of have critiqued habitat banking and provided ways of improving it. But
okay, great, thank you. That helps to shine a better light on it. So a question from the floor: is climate change considered in compensation? Flooding, drought, other kind of factors. Does anybody want to speak to that? Maybe Belinda, have you guys considered that?
At this point, on the implementing through planning approval side, we're really just looking at the policy application and the loss of the feature itself, and relying on the work that we did in 2017 on the ESV, the ecosystem service values. So I would suggest that our policies are ones that are, it's early days. We're still growing and learning. So I think that is something we need to write in and consider more to these policies. And perhaps Krista can speak to how we're considering it more on the implementation, get the projects in the ground side of things.
Sure, yeah, thanks. Yeah, like we definitely take into consideration when going through the process of choosing the locations of where we're going to be doing this work, as well as it's been taken into consideration in all of our designs. When, especially on the tree planting side, where we've started through our forestry program planting a variety of different species to make sure that we're slowly bringing in and addressing for climate change. We're looking for that a little bit more on the, when we're doing modeling and taking a look at what the site is going to do and how much water it has to maintain. And as far as when we're looking at the wetland side, so it's definitely taken in consideration, and we're actually starting to study some of the wetlands that were implemented because they're brand new. So we're working with Lakehead University to study the carbon on these wetlands to see what kind of impact they're having on sequestration compared to a wetland that's been there for many, many years. So we're definitely trying to think about these things and how we can consider those when we're doing our design work and all these projects.
Thanks for that, Krista. I know certainly in some of our projects we're looking at applying a certain drought factor, or flow change factors to some of the calculations which would influence design, obviously. Great, let's find another one from the floor. So when offsetting on private land, is there any documentation that is registered in the land titles office so that future owners and government staff in 10 or 20 years are made aware that the lands were offsetted and can't be developed on? This is more towards, of course, terrestrial offsetting. Anybody want to provide any thoughts on that one?
Sure, I can start at least. We haven't done any on private land yet. So in our policy and in our terms of reference for implementation, there's language around having some sort of agreement. So obviously like some sort of conservation easement or something that's, a little bit more concrete would be amazing to have in place. So it is protected in perpetuity. But that might become a difficult thing with some of these private landowners not wanting to go down that road. And how do we continue to do this work and try to protect it as best as possible? The only example we have, which is the first one that's approved, but it's not been implemented or started yet. It's in a valley land that right now, based on policies and what's in place, it would never be able to be developed. So you have that kind of protection in place, but now we need to go down the road of what kind of agreement do we want to be put in place with this landowner, and how do we move forward? And I know there's been conversations about bringing in the municipality and whether they would have an interest in taking on the lands and then us doing the work. So it's very much a work in progress, and it's something that we need to figure out as we're moving forward.
If I can jump in just on the planning side of things.
Yep.
So the way we do it in situations where it's a developer-led offsetting through a planning approval, through that process, the lands are appropriately zoned and designated to like an environmental protection designation and zone, and are conveyed to the municipality. So that's how we try to get it, at the front end.
Keeping it in the family, so to speak. Anybody else, Noah or Laura, anybody want in on that one?
Oh, I think that was well answered. It really does speak to the fact that ideally offsetting action should be occurring on public lands. So lands not necessarily that started out as public lands, but lands that are secured or conveyed to a public agency through the process, so that there is that assurance that those ecosystems are going to be maintained. And the other important component of that is that so that they can be accessed as well, because in many cases, and we're not just trying to offset features strictly for their biodiversity, but also for the ecosystem services that they're providing. And a big one is allowing people access to them, to use them in a passive way. And you can't do that on private lands typically. So, I think it is really important in many cases, in most cases, to secure the lands in public ownership in some way.
And I think that's certainly the easiest of all. So this one is a similar or a follow-up kind of question to that one, is there any requirement or thought to requiring a bond or letter of credit from the proponent to ensure the proposed compensation work and longer term monitoring is completed as proposed? And maybe Laura, what experience have you had with that at this point?
It's fairly common to require a letter of credit for the length of the monitoring. So in 5 years or whatever that is. I'm not aware of anything beyond that. So within the 5-year mark, there might be an additional checkpoint, maybe halfway through, where you get half of it back to say it's been implemented, it's going according to plan. And then at the end of it, you can basically say we've accomplished what we said we wanted to, if that's realistic. If you've created a woodland in 5 years, it's kind of hard to say, but you're on the right track basically. And then they get their full letter of credit back. That's all I'm aware of.
Well, at that time, by that time, we should be seeing whether their trees are surviving, and you know, I mean, there are other factors that can come along, like our emerald ash borer or drought or things like that that could affect them. But, anybody else? Melinda, do you guys require that kind of a tool?
No, we don't. We do it through agreements. Mostly it's written within the subdivision agreement with respect to monitoring and whatnot tied to that. As far as our own projects, obviously we're monitoring and making sure that they're as successful as they can be.
Okay. Anybody else? Nobody else on that one? Okay. So another question, for proposed offsets, I've seen an EIS. Lost part of, oops, oh dear, there we go. I just need to move it over, hang on. An EIS has been completed and there's data about the general use of the area. However, there often isn't very specific and long-term data, e.g. soil carbon composition of a wetland. Additionally, in the case of wetlands, literature suggests that offsets tend to degrade after about 5 years. So when monitoring typically ends. So how do you fill data gaps to more accurately determine biodiversity value? And how do you ensure long-term monitoring of offset ecosystems? Anybody want to start that one off?
I can start. I don't have much to add. We're very, very early on most of these projects. Like our wetlands have either just been implemented this year or last year. So our monitoring at this point is like, how's the construction doing? Right. So kind of that's where we're at. And some of our tree planting projects, it's on, it's more so on just like survival rates at this point. We are having a lot of discussions about the longer term monitoring of what needs to do and how do we determine the biodiversity value of before and after. You know, but we've been, I would say, fairly lucky in the sites that we've done so far, where it's been kind of a blank slate, where the biodiversity is clearly quite low. It's a flooded park that has nothing really growing on it, that we're able to enhance and provide, you know, trails and do lots of different things on it. But it is something that we're putting a lot of thought into what we do in the future. But at this point, we're so early in the game that we're not quite there yet. But I can pass it off to other people that might have more experience with it to date.
Anybody else want in?
I guess I can jump in briefly at the front end. So I think part of the question relates to how do you determine the biodiversity value of the initial, like of the site that's going to be impacted, and does that require any additional information that's typically not collected through the planning process or the infrastructure process? And that's we really struggled with that one quite a bit at TRCA, and there was a lot of pushback, or maybe that's the wrong way of putting it, but there was a lot of consideration, I guess, for ensuring that, you know, we weren't going to be creating a whole bunch new sort of restrictions or requirements for new data in making the decisions. So we had to balance that one a little bit. We do have some requirements for some additional information to help establish the ratios that are needed, the restoration ratios, but in most cases we find that the information that's collected through the EIS, like the environmental impact statement and other studies, is enough to, you know, make the determination around whether it's appropriate to allow the impact to occur. And then on the back end, in terms of monitoring the restoration work, that's a really difficult and ongoing challenge. We require at least 5 years of data or monitoring, and in some cases beyond that, but that's also a bit of a negotiation that needs to happen with the municipality and the proponent and others about what makes the most sense on a case-by-case basis. But a great question, and one that certainly continues to be a bit of a challenge for sure.
Well, and I think it goes to, I think it was Melinda's earlier point that you have to have enough rationalization for why the offsetting is going to be required, as opposed to just saying, I'll pay for it, let it go. So we need to understand what it is and what it's doing at the beginning, I think. So great, thank you. Okay, another question here, and I just maybe a little more illumination around what is the legislative framework used to require ecological offsetting? Is it through the PPS and the municipality's OP? and MOUs with the municipalities to enforce those policies of the OP? Is it ever used to offset wetland loss through the Conservation Authorities Act? So maybe just a little more explanation on that front. Melinda, you want to start with that one?
Sure. I know I have a table on that. I'm just looking for it. So. Another guilty confession this morning, Deb. Yeah, so we have framed ours using the Planning Act and the PPS. Within our watershed, we also have the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan, which is pretty handy to lean on in these situations. So really just the overarching approach of no net loss and any mitigation approaches. So that's how we've been applying it. And we've been very lucky that our partner municipalities have been implementing and incorporating these policies within their official plans so we can apply it through those.
Noah, you went in on that?
Sure. I should qualify anything I say by starting that I am not a planner. But yeah, this is one that we've also kind of struggled with as well. You know, and in some cases it's not, you know, it's not necessarily black and white, I guess, in terms of, you know, what needs to be protected and what doesn't. There's definitely a gray area and a lot of opportunity for sort of professional interpretation. And so in some cases, you know, there may be a feature that is ultimately determined not to be subject to the PPS. It doesn't meet the qualifications to be a, you know, provincially significant feature, and the municipal policies may also not necessarily apply. And in those cases, I guess in some instances, strictly speaking, that feature could be removed without any offsetting or compensation. But what we found is that in a lot of the cases, the proponent, the municipality, the CA are all willing to you know, negotiate and move forward, recognizing that it is important to try and restore or offset the losses. And so, I guess what I'm trying to say, sort of in a long-winded way, is that in some cases there isn't a lot of legislative direction there, but we have still been relatively successful in securing offsetting or compensation for features that aren't necessarily protected through an existing piece of legislation or policy.
Thanks, Noah. I just a comment in the chat box is that just a comment. I think this type of work should always feel uncomfortable. If it starts to feel comfortable, that should be a red flag. And I think that's a really good point, that we're always on the edge of making these decisions. Sometimes they're probably reasonably easy if we're talking about a cornfield that's part of a buffer that we're going to compensate for. But most of the things that we really have to wrestle with are the natural heritage features that ideally we would have left alone. A few more questions from the chat or from the Q&A box. So here's one, Melinda. If offsetting is intended to be a last resort, there are challenges of bringing up offsetting at pre-consultation. So do you have any recommendations on how to get the info out early, but at the right stage and with the right message?
Sure. Just to be clear, it's not generally CA staff who show up at pre-consultations and start waving the flag about, hey, check out our offsetting policy. It's generally the proponent showing up saying, oh, yeah, we know there's woodland there. We're gonna pay you for it. It's fine. So that's where the conversation begins. So the conversation then becomes one of an educating one, and making show at those pre-consultation discussions, it's, you know, us, the municipality, and the proponent around the table. So it becomes the education session of, here are the applicable land use policies that have to be, you know, adhered to. And as a very last resort, here's our offsetting policy. So that's how the discussion comes about. So please don't think that I'm saying we show up and say, hey, let's offset, because by all means, we do not. So we make it very clear, though, in all of our pre-consultation checklist documents that go out as a package. All of our resource material is there, so including our offsetting policies and all of our technical guidelines. So that's the approach we take, and we are very clear that it's not the first step, it's the last step.
And Laura, have you had experience with people trying to just sort of walk in on that at that level and say, this is how we want to run it at the beginning of the process?
Yeah, or we're hired after they've already done it without approvals. Yeah, that's definitely a common mindset, and we really want to encourage them or just educate them on what is involved. It's not always the cheapest option. It may be in some cases, it may be the more efficient land use option, but yeah, there's a lot of things to consider that I hope that these offsetting guidelines can just put that into perspective.
Thank you. Another question, how do you relate the idea of no negative impacts versus net gain or no net loss? So there are three different topics or considerations through this process, and I maybe want to explore that a little bit more. I hear, I don't know who would like to start with that. Noah, do you want to start with that?
I can, although it might be better to have some planners speak to it as well. But so the way that I'm interpreting that question is that the provincial policy statement speaks to no negative impact, and can you relate removing a feature or a portion of a feature and offsetting it ultimately so that there is no net loss to that? Like, I guess, would that be permitted under the PPS if you can demonstrate that there is, after a certain period of time, no net loss? And that's a good question, and that I don't know if I'm able to really answer all that effectively. I think some of the planners probably involved might be better at answering that, if I'm interpreting the question correctly. So I might defer that one, actually, Deb.
All right, Melinda, do you want to take a crack?
Yeah, I guess I can try. Might be easiest if I maybe give a scenario or like a context scenario.
Sure.
So in our watershed, there's a large secondary plan area, one of our municipalities, growing very, very quickly. And a sub-watershed impact study was completed a number of years ago. Natural heritage system was identified through that process. And there are a number of outliers. So little outlying wetland pockets, little outlying woodland pockets throughout that area. So not meeting the test of significance to be a significant feature, not provincially significant, not identified for protection through the municipality's official plan. They are identified as lands for development. So with that, when the EIS comes in, they're demonstrating the no negative impact. They're, working their way through that test. And so it's really the, no net loss that they're dealing with respect to proposing to remove the feature and use our offsetting policies. We're really lucky in that instance, and that the SIS has very clear language that any of these outlier features that are not identified as features within the secondary plan are to be addressed through offsetting. So we were lucky enough to cover that base early on. And so I don't know if that helps at all. And just being clear that these policies are generally applied to these outlying features or buffers to features or these pinch points in development. We don't generally see them as somebody coming in wanting to remove a large tract of a significant feature, because that would just never be considered. I don't know if that answers the question at all.
Well, the owner of the question will have to put something in the chat to let us know if it has got it covered or not. So I think the bottom line is these things are, I'm going to say, poorly defined, and the answers to them are difficult to say yes, we're there. There's no black and white. There's no yes, that's the answer. There's a significant series of gray around that. So. Here's a question for you, Laura, on the NRSI Caledon site. What planning policies were used that required compensation for single dwelling?
Yeah, so that was also within the Niagara Escarpment Commission jurisdiction, but I believe CBC was the main agency reviewing the file. And I think we did majority of the field surveys and the EIS study a few years ago, and the CBC guidelines weren't in place at the time. So it was kind of nearing the end of the approval stage where that requirement came into play to follow the guidelines. And my coworker Katarina I see her in the attendees list. She might be able to chime in on the chat for a bit more details. She's been more heavily involved in the early stages of this project. So in terms of the planning requirements, all your standard official plan policies, provincial policy statement, all the standard stuff you would be addressing in the EIS, but then this ecological offsetting was basically to recognize that this is considered significant woodland and what kind of offsetting would be required. And that's where the CBC guidelines came into play. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's as much as I know.
Well, I know Christine Wilson from CBC is in the background here, and so she may be able to provide some additional answering on the actual question itself. So if she wants to type anything in there, or Katarina wants to mention anything in the chat, feel free. Thank you. All right, let me see what we'll go to next. Oops, little boxes keep piping up on top of my box. All right. What is the outcome of an offsetting or compensation plan that does not become successful? If the planning process shows there would be no net loss or net gain, but once implemented, it doesn't provide the function intended, is there a consequence? Who wants to start that? Krista?
Yeah, sure. So I'm not sure what happens, like if a proponent, like I'll let Melinda type in on that end of sort of like if a developer did something that wasn't like if all the trees died or something like that, of how that would go through that process. But on our end, we're monitoring them very closely. Like as I alluded to, with one of the projects we're we see things that where the tree planting is not going and successful, we can go back in and plant. We're watching to make sure that if a wetland's supposed to have a certain amount of water, that we're monitoring that to see how things are going. So as I said, we're very early on this. So the consequences are that we can come back to the committee and see is it feasible to add more money to this project to make it function as per plan. If it's not, then we need to, do we go out to other resources? What are our options there? But so far to date, we're not really in that. We haven't had anything become unsuccessful or not do what it's supposed to do, so that we haven't had to go down that road. But we've had these conversations because we've thought about this of like, what happens if something like this happens? So we fortunately haven't had to go down that road, but it is conversations that we've had to start thinking about what would we do if that would happen. But and then on Melinda's side of things, I'm sure she has some insight on the developer side of things.
Yeah, thanks, Krista. So as Krista mentioned, we're still in the infancy of these projects and this program. So early days, again, growing and learning. On the planning side, when somebody is choosing offsetting or compensation, they are required to provide an ecological offsetting strategy or plan. It is a condition of approval under a subdivision approval or site plan approval, as an example. It is written into the legal agreement, so the site plan approval or registered site plan agreement or the plan of subdivision agreement, and as well as the monitoring that's required as part of that strategy. And if there's any deviance from that, or things just aren't working out, then it really becomes a matter of they're not adhering to what they have committed to through their registered subdivision agreement. And so we can kind of get back to the proponent through that. And that's more of a legal discussion that happens at that point. And luckily we haven't gotten there yet, and I hope we never do.
Yeah, well, and that's where it is still being as a work in progress, and we're going to learn from the experiences we have, and then we're going to have to go back and revise some of our processes and our activities. There's a question here that, and I think in part it could be a two-part question, but are there any land uses or locations that should not be included in net benefit calculations, such as drainage easements, construction access roads, gas pipeline easements, municipal tile drains? So are there things that that you would see we should not be including in our calculations? Have you had any experience in those, and what's your process on that? Anybody?
So I can talk about on the outputs on our side. Some of the things are listed there. They're not included in the hectares that we're using as what we consider natural heritage improvements, and like even things like trails, because one of the designs actually had a trail in and around the property, and that's not, you know, as much as it's enhancing it for the community to make them become accessible and be able to get to the wetlands and see what we've done and have those components, it's not considered in the total area of our outputs of the program. So we're not considering those if they're not having that kind of features, but on, you know, I'll leave it to someone else to talk about it on the other side of it.
Anybody else want in on that? I'm not seeing anyone saying, oh, I got it. So it may be something we're not having too much experience with at this point, but and a similar, but well, a different scope of the question, but here's one that I think is important for us to explore just a little bit in the last few minutes that we have, is what type of features or habitats should be considered for compensation? How do you determine what's replaceable versus irreplaceable? And are there timeframes? So I think we've talked a little bit about woodlands having a different time frame than wetlands, but really it's, I think a lot of people are suggesting that we're going in and taking out very significant areas, and once in a while that happens, but what would we say no to from the beginning, and only be looking to change if pressed in a way that we weren't comfortable with in the first place? But what kind of features? So I think of fens. You can't replace a fen because it's groundwater and surface water and vegetation, and you just can't replace the groundwater conditions. So how would you do that? So any other thoughts on types of features that are just virtually irreplaceable, and we really wouldn't want to see even compensation for anything in that way? Noah?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, generally any wetland that's considered to be provincially significant, habitat for endangered species, certainly, you know, a lot of the direction I think is provided in the PPS, right? Provincially significant features, whether they're wetlands or significant wildlife habitat, endangered species habitat, you know, all those areas I would say really ought to be off limits, and are in 95% of the time. I guess the one thing I would mention though, and typically where our brains generally go to when we start to think about offsetting is private land development. And there's a lot of reasons why we do go there in terms of our thinking, but I think it's also important to recognize that public infrastructure also has the potential for pretty significant impacts, and sometimes greater impacts than private land development. Because if you think about widening an existing road or some other linear infrastructure, the opportunities to place that infrastructure in different areas or in different alignments can be very, very limited. And so what we find in many cases is that it's infrastructure expansion or new projects that are actually having the greatest impact on some of the more significant features, and very little opportunity to completely avoid that.
Yes, those are more challenging for sure, and that's where we do find ourselves losing some features that we wouldn't normally want to do. So although in typical process you're supposed to be avoiding those too in an EA, but that doesn't always happen either. So anyone else want in on that one? All right. Well, we are actually at the end, or almost close to the end of our time. So I think I'm going to close the questions. For those of you, there are a few questions that are directed to the individual panelists. So if you would like to go in and type your answer in the box, feel free while we're doing our close up activities. I would just really like to thank you folks for coming, preparing today, and having this conversation with us, or starting the conversation. You know, we were hoping to get some municipalities to provide some of their experiences, but they were like, well, we haven't finished them yet. We haven't done this. So we're early days in applying compensation and the impacts, or the looking at how it's worked and what we would do differently. we're early days in this. And so I think it's the beginning of the conversation about how well it's working, and has it been a good tool in our toolbox. And I do like to call it a tool in our toolbox. And I say, but I don't use the same tool for everything in my toolbox. I have my hammer, I have my screwdriver, I have my mallet, I have the things that I will use infrequently, and I'll have the things that I use more frequently. And this is one of those tools that in the right place at the right time. And I think you guys expanded on that and showed some of those circumstances, which some of them are legacy, some of them are new, some of them are things that are harder to avoid. So thank you for taking your time to create those stories for us and help us understand this more. I would also like to thank the Latornell Conference Steering Committee members who have been behind the scenes pulling these Latornell Conservation Matters sessions together. Janet Ivey is the chair of the Latornell Conference. Jamie Jowdry, who's been working the chat box today. She's our conference program chair and responsible for really driving these webinars. We have Mario Maillet and Karen Anderson of Offset Inc., who are the Latornell Conference organizers. So they've been working the Zoom. We've had Sarah Hodgkiss and Lake St. Clair Region Conservation Authority, and Eric Gilbert of Oxford County, who've been working the questions. Christine Wilson and Scott Sampson, both of CBC, helped to pull this together as well. So right now we're going to put up, unless it's already up on the screen, we'll put up a slide of some of the resources that were mentioned today for everyone to take away. This will be posted on the website. We have a few more sessions coming this fall and into the new year. So please register for our next webinar, which is on November 16th on Indigenous protected and conserved areas. What does that mean and what could that look like? And we do have some final polls for you to complete before you leave. So if you wouldn't mind completing those. And as a reminder, this session has been recorded, and it's going to be posted on the Latornell Symposium website for anyone to watch, and you will be notified once it's posted. And I just want to thank you for taking the time today to learn more about ecological offsetting, and hopefully you learned something, and you can reach out to both our panelists and as well as other CAs who have that experience as well. So with that, we'll wrap up our webinar for today. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.